What if a single sentence, spoken during a high-profile interview, could reveal far more than it appears on the surface? On June 8, 2026, former U.S. President Donald Trump sat down for an interview with the Financial Times. During that conversation, he delivered a striking statement that quickly captured international attention. According to Trump, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had little room to maneuver. Net will have no choice. I call the shots. He is not the decision maker. Those are strong words, the kind of words that suggest complete confidence, the kind of words that imply Washington remains firmly in control of events unfolding across the Middle East. At first glance, the message seemed clear. The United States was directing the strategy, and its regional partner would follow. But what happened next surprised nearly everyone watching. Just 3 hours after Trump made those remarks, Israel reportedly launched dozens of fighter jets in a large-scale operation targeting military facilities and petrochemical sites deep inside Iranian territory. Then came another surprise. The White House remained silent. There was no immediate confirmation, no denial, no emergency briefing, no detailed explanation. For hours, Washington offered virtually no public response. Almost instantly, major media outlets around the world began advancing a familiar narrative. According to that interpretation, Trump had lost control. The argument was straightforward. Netanyahu had openly defied Washington, demonstrating that Israel was prepared to act independently, regardless of American wishes. Among those promoting this view was Democratic Senator Chris Murphy, who argued that the situation represented an embarrassment for both Trump and American influence. In his view, if Trump publicly claimed he would stop Netanyahu from retaliating and Israel proceeded anyway, it suggested a significant failure of U.S. leverage. For many observers, that explanation seemed convincing. After all, it follows a compelling storyline. A smaller nation appears to outmaneuver a global superpower. A regional ally refuses instructions from its most powerful partner. The apparent underdog asserts its independence. It's a narrative that is easy to understand and even easier to believe. But what if the reality is more complicated? What if the events of June 7 and June 8 can be interpreted in several different ways? And what if the most important explanation is the one receiving the least attention? To answer those questions, we need to examine 3 competing theories that attempt to explain what actually happened. Each theory relies on many of the same events. Each offers a different interpretation, and only by examining them side by side can we begin to understand the broader picture. 3 competing theories. Before reviewing the evidence, it's important to understand the framework of the debate. Without understanding the competing theories, it becomes difficult to evaluate the significance of the events themselves. The first theory is commonly known as the tail wags the dog. Most people have heard this expression before. Normally, a dog controls the movement of its tail. The tail simply follows. But in politics, critics sometimes argue that the opposite occurs. A smaller actor can exert influence over a much larger one. Applied to this situation, the theory suggests that Israel, the smaller actor, is effectively directing American policy rather than responding to it. Supporters of this view argue that Netanyahu successfully pushed Washington toward policies and actions that the United States might not have otherwise pursued. Under this interpretation, Trump's reported attempt to restrain Israeli retaliation failed because Netanyahu chose to ignore him. The Israeli leader acted independently, proving that he, not Washington, was making the crucial decisions. This remains one of the most widely discussed explanations in many Western media circles, but it is far from the only explanation. The second theory offers a very different perspective. Rather than portraying America as being manipulated, this argument suggests that Washington is deliberately allowing Israel to act as a regional proxy. In other words, Israel is not pulling the United States into a conflict. Instead, the United States is allowing Israel to pursue actions that align with broader American strategic objectives. Under this framework, public disagreements may not necessarily indicate genuine divisions. Instead, they may provide political cover. Washington can present itself as the voice of restraint while still benefiting from developments occurring on the ground. The appearance of disagreement becomes useful in itself, but the story doesn't end there. There is a third theory, one that takes the argument a step further. This framework can be described as the theater of consent. According to this view, both sides understand exactly what they are doing. Rather than merely tolerating one another's actions, they may be performing different roles for different audiences. Trump needs to project one image to American voters. Netanyahu needs to project a different image to Israeli voters. Each leader faces distinct political pressures. Each must satisfy different constituencies. And, according to supporters of this theory, the appearance of conflict between them may serve political purposes for both sides simultaneously. If that sounds extraordinary, the evidence presented by proponents of this theory becomes even more intriguing. Because the next development changed everything. To understand why, we need to examine the strongest possible case for the first theory, the argument that Netanyahu truly defied Trump. Only then can we determine whether the evidence supports it. The strongest case for the tail wags the dog. To evaluate any theory fairly, it's important to consider its strongest arguments rather than its weakest ones. So let's begin by giving this explanation every possible advantage. The central claim is simple. Trump reportedly contacted Netanyahu directly and urged restraint. Multiple reports suggested that American officials believed those conversations were serious and that Trump genuinely expected Israel to hold back. According to those accounts, Trump was confident enough in his influence to publicly declare that Netanyahu would have no choice but to follow Washington's direction. Then Israel launched its operation anyway. On the surface, that sequence appears difficult to ignore. Supporters of this theory also point to reports of tension between the two leaders in previous weeks. According to public remarks attributed to Trump, earlier conversations regarding Israeli military actions had become heated and frustrating. The relationship, at least publicly, appeared strained. There's another important factor to consider: domestic politics inside Israel. Former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, one of Netanyahu's most prominent political rivals, reportedly argued that excessive dependence on Washington would undermine Israel's sovereignty.
In a highly competitive political environment, appearing weak or subordinate to foreign pressure can carry significant costs.
From that perspective, Netanyahu had strong incentives to demonstrate independence. He needed to show Israeli voters that decisions affecting national security would be made in Jerusalem, not Washington. Viewed through that lens, the theory possesses a certain internal logic. Trump says stop, Netanyahu proceeds. The world watches. And many conclude that Israel openly ignored American pressure. At first glance, the evidence appears compelling. But one crucial question remains unanswered. In fact, it may be the most important question in this entire story. If Washington genuinely wanted to stop Israel, why didn't it use the tools available to do so? That question would become the foundation for a completely different interpretation of events. And once analysts began examining it more closely, the narrative started to shift.
The answer became far less straightforward than many headlines suggested.
The question that changes everything. If the United States truly wanted to prevent Israeli military action, what practical steps could it have taken? This question sits at the center of the entire debate. The reason is simple. The United States possesses enormous influence over Israel's military capabilities. Washington provides advanced military equipment, intelligence support, and extensive defense cooperation. Over the years, that relationship has become deeply integrated across multiple levels of security planning and regional strategy. Because of that reality, critics of the tail wags the dog theory argue that a genuine effort to stop military action would likely have involved more than public statements. And that is where a second interpretation begins to emerge. Supporters of the alternative view argue that the key issue is not what was said publicly, but what actions were taken behind the scenes.
According to this perspective, the most revealing detail is not Trump's statement to the press. It's what happened afterward. Despite reports of disagreement, there were no immediate indications that military cooperation had been suspended. There were no publicly announced restrictions on intelligence sharing, no reports of a breakdown in defense coordination, no visible signs that the strategic relationship had suddenly changed. For supporters of the second theory, that raises an important question. If Washington had truly been blindsided and embarrassed, why did the broader framework of cooperation appear largely unchanged? That question has led some analysts to examine a wider collection of evidence. And that's where the story becomes even more complicated. A different interpretation emerges. Several organizations, researchers, and political observers have advanced an alternative explanation. Their argument is not that Israel controls the United States. Instead, they suggest that American and Israeli strategic objectives frequently overlap.
When that happens, public disagreements may not necessarily reflect genuine policy conflicts. Rather, they may represent differences in messaging, timing, or political presentation. According to this interpretation, both governments can benefit from maintaining separate public narratives while pursuing objectives that broadly align behind the scenes. Supporters of this view point to a number of analyses published by advocacy groups, policy organizations, and commentators who argue that regional military developments should be understood within a larger geopolitical framework. Their central claim is that the conflict extends far beyond bilateral tensions between Israel and Iran. Instead, they argue that it intersects with broader questions involving energy security, regional influence, global trade routes, and great power competition.
Whether one agrees with that assessment or not, it has become an increasingly prominent part of the debate.
And it leads directly to another critical development. Because while political commentators argued about who was controlling whom, events on the ground continue to unfold at remarkable speed. The next timeline is where many analysts believe the real story begins. June 7, a day packed with critical developments. To understand why this debate intensified, it's necessary to look closely at the sequence of events that unfolded on June 7th. Several major developments occurred within a relatively short period of time. Taken individually, each event attracted attention. Taken together, supporters of the second and third theories argue that they reveal a much larger pattern. The first development involved Iranian financial assets.
According to reports, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent invoked authorities under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, commonly known as IEEPA. The move reportedly affected billions of dollars in frozen Iranian assets. Supporters of the alternative interpretation argue that the timing of this decision was especially significant. Why?
because Iranian officials had repeatedly emphasized one particular issue during diplomatic discussions: access to frozen assets. According to their public position, progress on that issue was viewed as an important component of any future negotiations. As a result, critics argued that the decision reduced the likelihood of near-term diplomatic progress. Iranian officials responded sharply, criticizing the move and rejecting the idea that those funds could be redirected elsewhere. Whether viewed as economic pressure or strategic leverage, the decision immediately became part of a larger geopolitical debate. But the story doesn't end there, because later that same day, attention shifted from economics to military developments. A strike in Beirut raises the stakes. Later on June 7, reports emerged that Israel had carried out strikes in Beirut's southern suburbs. Casualties were reported, and the operation quickly became another focal point in the escalating regional crisis. What made this event especially significant, according to many observers, was its relationship to previous Iranian warnings. Days earlier, Iranian military officials had publicly communicated what they described as a red line. The message was reportedly distributed in multiple languages and warned that certain actions could trigger a response. Supporters of the theater of consent theory place enormous importance on this detail. Their argument is straightforward. If military planners already knew how Iran was likely to respond under specific circumstances, then subsequent events may have been more predictable than they appeared. Whether that conclusion is justified remains heavily debated. But there is little disagreement that the warning itself became a major point of discussion once the situation escalated. And then another report surfaced. According to media accounts, questions emerged regarding whether American officials had prior knowledge of certain military operations. No definitive public confirmation followed, but neither did a clear public denial. For some analysts, that silence became almost as important as the events themselves. Because in international politics, what governments choose not to say can sometimes attract as much attention as what they do say. The lack of a definitive response fueled further speculation, and it set the stage for what happened next: Iran's rapid response. One of the most discussed aspects of the crisis was the speed of Iran's retaliation. Reports indicated that ballistic missile strikes followed within a relatively short period after the events in Beirut. That rapid response raised immediate questions. How had decisions been made so quickly? What command structures were involved? And had the response been prepared in advance? This is where discussions about Iran's military doctrine entered the conversation. Some analysts pointed to concepts often described as decentralized or distributed command structures. Under such systems, certain operational decisions can be executed more rapidly because predetermined conditions and response mechanisms are established beforehand. Supporters of the theory argue that this helps explain the speed of the retaliation. Rather than beginning deliberations after the triggering event occurred, elements of the response framework may already have been in place. If true, that would significantly shorten reaction times. And that possibility leads to another important question. If regional actors understood how these mechanisms worked, could they have anticipated the response before it happened? For proponents of the third theory, the answer is yes. In their view, the retaliation was not merely expected, it was predictable. And if it was predictable, then every major player involved may have understood the likely chain of events well in advance. That possibility forms the foundation of what comes next. Because according to supporters of the theater of consent framework, the public narrative and the strategic reality may not have been the same thing. And that distinction could be the most important detail of all. Continuing directly from Part 2, Part 3. The theory of theater of consent. At the heart of the third theory is a simple but powerful idea. In politics, governments often need to satisfy multiple audiences at the same time. What leaders say publicly is not always aimed at their counterparts overseas. Frequently, it is directed at voters, political rivals, allies, investors, or international partners. According to supporters of the theater of consent theory, that reality may help explain many of the apparent contradictions surrounding the events of June 7th and June 8th. Their argument is that both Washington and Jerusalem had political reasons to project different images. Trump needed to appear as the leader pursuing stability and restraint. For months, concerns about global conflict, inflation, and energy prices had remained major issues for voters and financial markets alike. Projecting the image of a negotiator seeking de-escalation carried obvious political advantages. Netanyahu faced a different challenge. Inside Israel, strength and independence remained central themes in national security debates. Any perception that major military decisions were being dictated by a foreign government could create political vulnerabilities. As a result, supporters of this theory argue that both leaders benefited from appearing to disagree. Trump could present himself as the voice of diplomacy, Netanyahu could present himself as the defender of Israeli sovereignty. And yet, despite those public appearances, broader strategic objectives could continue moving forward. If that interpretation is correct, then what looked like a confrontation may have functioned as something entirely different. Not a breakdown, not a rebellion, but a carefully managed separation between public messaging and strategic coordination. Whether that conclusion is accurate remains a matter of intense debate. But supporters believe several developments fit the pattern remarkably well.
And one of the most significant involves what happened after Iranian missiles were launched. The battle behind the headlines. When news organizations reported the missile strikes, most coverage naturally focused on the immediate military implications. How many missiles were launched, which targets were selected, how effective were the defensive systems. But military analysts were paying attention to something else as well: data. Every missile launch generates valuable information. Every interception creates new insights. Every engagement provides intelligence that cannot be replicated through simulations alone. This is why modern conflicts often become enormous sources of operational knowledge. Radar systems track trajectories. Command centers monitor response times. Defense networks evaluate performance under real-world conditions. Military planners learn what works, what doesn't, and where improvements are needed. Supporters of the third theory argue that this aspect of the conflict deserves far more attention than it receives. Because once missiles are launched and defensive systems respond, every participant gains information. The attacking side learns, the defending side learns, and outside observers learn as well. The most important detail is still ahead, because at the same time these military exchanges were occurring, competing narratives were emerging regarding Iran's remaining capabilities. Some public statements suggested that Iranian military capacity had been dramatically reduced. Other assessments indicated that Tehran retained substantial capabilities despite previous setbacks. Those conflicting evaluations immediately raised new questions. How much capability remained? What had been degraded? What could still be deployed? And perhaps most importantly, who possessed the most accurate information? As analysts debated those questions, the broader geopolitical implications became increasingly difficult to ignore. Why energy and geopolitics remain central? Beyond the military dimension lies another issue that repeatedly appears throughout discussions of the crisis: energy. For decades, Middle Eastern energy resources have occupied a central position in global politics. Control of supply routes, production capacity, transportation corridors, and strategic reserves affects virtually every major economy. Because of that reality, many observers argue that regional conflicts cannot be viewed solely through military or ideological lenses. Economic considerations inevitably become part of the equation. Several commentators cited statements from political leaders discussing the strategic significance of global energy markets. Those remarks fueled speculation that larger geopolitical calculations might be influencing decision-making. Supporters of the broader strategic interpretation argue that regional confrontations must be understood within the context of global competition involving the United States, China, and Russia. Their reasoning is straightforward. Major powers do not evaluate events solely based on immediate military outcomes. They also consider long-term consequences for trade networks, energy security, economic leverage, and geopolitical influence. If a conflict affects those areas, its significance extends far beyond the battlefield. Whether one accepts that argument or rejects it, there is little doubt that energy remains one of the most consequential variables in the entire equation. And that leads to perhaps the biggest question of all: who ultimately benefits from escalation? Following the chain of consequences. One of the most common principles in geopolitical analysis is simple: follow the incentives. Whenever a major event occurs, analysts attempt to identify who gains advantages, who suffers losses, and how the balance of power changes. Supporters of the theater of consent theory argue that this approach reveals patterns that are often overlooked. They point to several developments. Economic pressure increased, military activity intensified, intelligence collection opportunities expanded, regional tensions escalated, and strategic calculations involving energy and trade routes became even more important. Viewed individually, each development can be explained in multiple ways. Viewed together, proponents argue, they suggest a larger framework. That framework does not necessarily require direct public coordination, nor does it require every actor to share identical objectives. Instead, it proposes that several powerful interests may benefit from similar outcomes at the same time. This is why supporters of the theory continue asking the same question. If the events represented a genuine breakdown between Washington and Jerusalem, why did so many of the resulting developments appear to align with broader strategic interests discussed by policymakers and analysts? For them, that question remains unresolved, and until it is answered, they argue that the mainstream narrative remains incomplete. 3 things to watch moving forward. Whenever analysts develop a theory, there is one reliable way to evaluate it: predictions. A useful theory should help explain future events, not just past ones. Supporters of these alternative interpretations have identified several indicators worth watching closely. The first involves future military activity. Will operations continue at the same pace? Will regional actors escalate further? Or will signs of restraint begin to emerge? The answer could reveal whether current developments represent a temporary crisis or part of a longer strategic process. The second involves official statements. Observers are paying close attention not only to what governments say, but also to what they choose not to say. Public confirmations, denials, clarifications, and diplomatic language often provide important clues regarding underlying policy positions. The third involves global markets.
Energy prices, shipping routes, investment flows, and financial reactions frequently offer early signals regarding how major institutions perceive risk. Markets may not predict everything, but they often reveal where participants believe events are heading. And that is why analysts around the world continue monitoring every development with extraordinary attention, because the next move could change the entire picture. At first glance, the story seems simple.
Trump publicly declared that he was in control. Hours later, Israel launched a major military operation.
Many observers immediately concluded that Netanyahu had ignored Washington. That explanation remains possible, but as we've seen, it is not the only interpretation. Others argue that deeper strategic alignment better explains the sequence of events. Still others believe public disagreements may serve political purposes while broader objectives remain unchanged. The truth may ultimately lie somewhere between these competing views. What makes this story so important is not merely the military action itself. It is the larger question it raises. How much of international politics takes place in public view, and how much occurs behind the scenes, hidden beneath carefully crafted narratives? That question remains unanswered. But one thing is certain. The developments of June 7 and June 8 have sparked a debate that is unlikely to disappear anytime soon.
As new information emerges, analysts, governments, and citizens alike will continue searching for answers.
And perhaps the most important lesson is this. Never focus only on the headline. Look at the timeline, look at the incentives, look at the consequences. Because sometimes the story everyone is talking about is only part of the story. And sometimes the most revealing details are the ones hiding in plain sight.